Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of the Primal Shift podcast. In today's episode, we're going to talk about a topic that has been proven most frustrating for both me and my wife. And I'm talking about environmental toxins, including xenoestrogens, endocrine-disrupting chemicals, uh, PFAS, forever chemicals, and anything in between. And the reason why those environmental toxins have been so frustrating for us was because we never fully understood the extent of our exposure. And once we started really digging through all the available scientific evidence and figuring out in what products, be it personal care, clothing, furniture, etc., we find those chemicals, we quickly realized that they're everywhere. And it was so frustrating to try to understand how can we possibly limit our exposure. You can't get away from them. That's right off the bat. There is no way of avoiding them completely. You can only mitigate. And so in this episode, I want to talk about specifically about the common types of environmental toxins, where you can find them. I already said everywhere, but to be more specific, in what products you can find those chemicals and foods, for example, how they impact your health potentially, why they are so sneaky. The negative impact of those chemicals might not show up immediately, it might show up years later, or even decades later sometimes. And most importantly, tips and tricks you can use to reduce your exposure significantly, depending on the state of health you're in. If you're super healthy, likely you can handle more exposure than someone who's already metabolically impaired or has, cancer or some other type of issue, maybe autoimmune concerns. And so those are really, at the end, the top tips that I can give you to start reducing your exposure immediately and to hopefully live a healthier life. Now, before we get started and into the nitty-gritty, please share, subscribe, follow, rate to help other people find this podcast as well. All right, so let's talk about, just very briefly, the types of, it's not an extensive list, but the most common types of environmental toxins. Heavy metals, obviously, I'm sure you're aware, lead, arsenic, and a lot of other heavy metals that you might be exposed to through drinking water, as we've seen in the past, over the last couple of years. Um, Plant-based products, they get absorbed from the soil, end up in produce, and so you might ingest them. And there are obviously different types of plants have different types or different amounts of exposure, and anything in between. Even sometimes in stainless steel products, you can find lead or other heavy metals that are used, for a coating or maybe for the print on it. We have some glassware that has, print on it, like measuring cups that have, heavy metals in there, and we didn't know about that. There are fluorinated chemicals, like also known as PFAS or forever chemicals. The problem with those is, as the name already implies, they stay forever where they are, in your body, in the soil, in the water, and it's very difficult, if not impossible, to get rid of them. And so you definitely want to limit your exposure to those, because once they're there, they're not going anywhere. Carcinogens, obviously, stuff that causes cancer. And at this point, I should maybe say that there are certain chemicals that fall into various categories. So there are chemicals that are both endocrine disrupting as well as carcinogenic. And so they might not always be in only one category. They might span multiple of those categories. Pesticides, and that includes both synthetic pesticides. So if you buy non-organic produce, for example, you might get exposed to pesticides that the farmers used to keep bugs off the produce, but also natural pesticides. Every plant, to various degrees, has pesticides to deter bugs and insects from consuming the vital parts of the plant, the leaves, the stems, the seeds, etc. So if you consume plants, you always consume pesticides. And there are some studies out there that actually suggest most of the pesticides we consume are in the plant that are natural plant pesticides, and not the ones we use, the synthetic ones we add on top. So that's something to consider depending on the type of diet you're on. Herbicides such as atrazine or glyphosate, highly carcinogenic, and they are very prevalent. You can find them almost in every source of drinking water, unless you filter it. There is, sources of residue of glyphosate and some of those other endocrine disruptors and carcinogenic compounds that are used in agriculture. VOCs, volatile organic compounds, from paint, from glues, from stains, etc., from furniture, or parts of the furniture might off-gas VOCs that you then inhale, and that can cause issues. Mold and mildew, obviously. Mold is a huge problem in many homes, often, inhabitants are unaware that there are mold issues, and then they wonder, why do I have, certain, brain fog or, other types of issues that are simply the result of long-term mold exposure. So those are some of the types. Now, where can you find them? Well, I already said they are everywhere. So, but let's be a little bit more specific so we can kind of, make our way down to trying to mitigate and remediate some of those issues. Cookware is a source of those toxins that you're likely exposed to every single day, even by cooking at home or by eating out. Non-stick cookware in particular has a lot of has microplastics, has sometimes those PFAS, and has a lot of those endocrine disruptors. And so be aware of what utensils, what pots and pans you use. We're going to talk about then some of the ones that I recommend, but those are a huge source of those environmental toxins. Personal care products, another thing that we expose ourselves to every single day, and maybe more so women, with makeup and some of face lotions, etc. But also men, deodorant, face creams, hand soap, sanitizers, all of those things. Most of those things, most of those products you can find in the store have endocrine disrupting properties, meaning they mimic the sex hormone estrogen. They connect to those receptors because every cell in your body has estrogen receptors. They connect and mimic the function of the hormone estrogen. And as you can imagine, in particular for men, too much estrogen, probably not a good thing, but even for women, too much estrogen can be problematic. And so personal care products, a huge source of those endocrine disruptors. Clothing. It turns out that all of the fancy clothing that we wear, from brands like Lululemon and stuff, they contain forever chemicals. And, especially if you wear them directly on your skin, in some cases, I did not know that either, but I heard that many women wear, those yoga pants and leggings and stuff without underwear. So your genitals are directly exposed to those forever chemicals. Not a good thing. But same with men, underwear, t-shirts, pants, socks. A lot of those products have, unfortunately, toxins that get absorbed through the skin. Birth control pill, by definition, it's estrogenic, a hormone-based birth control pill, at least that is. That is, by definition, estrogenic. So it mimics, again, it has either estrogen or it has chemicals that mimic estrogen. And those have a lot of issues that we'll talk a little bit about more in this podcast. Tap water, another thing, the water that you get from your local water authority is not free of chemicals. It's not free of toxins. Some of those chemicals are actually added in to sanitize the water, like chlorine, and then its metabolites when it reacts with certain organic compounds in the water. But there are a lot of things that the water authority doesn't filter for or take out, and birth control hormones are one of those things. So from all the, the urine of women that use birth control, all of it goes into the drinking water, into the sewer system, and then it gets recycled back into our drinking water, and it usually does not get filtered out. But that's just one of the issues in tap water. Food storage containers, plastic food storage containers to be more precise, are another huge source of endocrine disruptors that can leach into liquid foods or salty foods or acidic foods at room temperature or above. So another huge issue. Hand sanitizers, if triclosan, an endocrine disruptor, and the problem is, and the same goes with, hand soaps, etc. And if you think, well, but I'm going to wash my hands then, and the water, takes care of that. No, it doesn't, because most of those, chemicals are attracted to lipids, to fat, so they stick on your skin because your skin is a little bit fatty, and it doesn't wash away with water because it doesn't bond with water very well. Another huge source. Produce, fruits and veggies, obviously. And even if you buy organic, you get the natural pesticides. So there's another huge source of those environmental toxins. Tea bags and coffee. Coffee is one of the most one of those plants where farmers use a lot of pesticides and herbicides. So it's the most bombarded kind of produce you can find, and then the hot water obviously makes it leach all of that into your coffee, and that's what you drink every day. The same goes with tea bags. Most tea bags are made out of plastic, microplastics that leach into the water. You drink it and they stay in your body almost forever. And then the air that we breathe. Unfortunately, the air at home in most houses or in most homes is not incredibly clean, and it's polluted by VOCs from furniture, from paint, from maybe mold, from your gas stove or appliance, etc. So another source, it's something that we breathe all the time, so we are constantly exposed to those things. So I know this all sounds very gloomy, and that was really one of the the reasons why we got so frustrated early on. Like, there is just no way you can escape that. And no, there isn't, right off the bat, but there are ways you can significantly reduce your exposure. But before we get to that, let's talk about how those toxins potentially impact your health. The carcinogens cause cancer, or at least significantly reduce your risk of developing cancer if you're exposed to those things long term. They can cause inflammation. They can cause metabolic dysfunction and organ issues like low thyroid levels or low thyroid hormone levels if your thyroid gland isn't working properly. They can disrupt the microbiome in your gut, which, the gut is like the center of your, or a key component of your immune system and other functions in your body. If your gut is not healthy, your immune system is likely not healthy, and that leads to a host of downstream issues, be it autoimmunity, be it, your likelihood to get sick increases, and a lot of other things that you don't want to deal with. Pure immune health, I already mentioned, and that often goes back to poor gut health, unfortunately. Weight gain or inability to lose weight, especially fat, those endocrine disruptors, and specifically the ones that mimic the sex hormone estrogen. Estrogen is a fattening hormone, so it makes your body store fat. The more estrogen you have, the less likely you lose weight in the form of body fat. Early puberty in girls, that's especially an issue with young females who are exposed to endocrine disruptors and some of those other chemicals early in their life. It's a huge issue that leads to, girls getting into puberty earlier and earlier. And that's not good for their health overall. Low testosterone in men, kind of the counterpart. Infertility. I don't know how many couples we know that have either issues getting pregnant or that then deal with preterm labor. I mean, my wife actually gave birth to Lucas, our son, who is now 7 and fortunately very healthy, but he was born at 30 weeks and 6 days, way early, and fortunately everything went well. But that's again, how many couples we know now that have issues with just giving birth, something that should come so naturally, or have preterm labor, or have to abort, even though they don't want to. The baby unfortunately sometimes dies or has significant issues during pregnancy. Erratic menstrual cycle, low sperm count, etc., etc. So there's so many issues that all go back to the exposure of those environmental toxins. So now that we know how bad it is and where they are and what kind of issues they can cause, let's talk about what you can do to significantly reduce your risk and mitigate some of those issues, because getting away is not possible. They're everywhere. So the only thing you can do is to look at the lowest hanging fruit, your greatest exposure, and try to mitigate that or reduce it at least significantly. And one of the easiest way you can do today is to filter your drinking water, filter the tap water, and to avoid purchasing water in plastic containers. Because again, plastic leaches endocrine disruptors. Almost every single type of plastic. There are only a few examples where we haven't seen endocrine disrupting activity yet, but most of it doesn't matter if it's BPA free or if it has BPA, because usually when a brand says it doesn't have BPA, then it's BPS or some other, bisphenol. Doesn't have to be bisphenol A. Or something else that is also or equally endocrine disrupting. So filter your tap water and avoid drinking out of plastic. And even though, and that's important to understand, most of the endocrine leaching activity occurs at room temperature or above. But that doesn't mean if you get a bottle of water in the grocery store from the fridge that it has always been refrigerated. It might have been in a warehouse at high temperatures or in a delivery truck or whatever. And, all of the endocrine disrupting chemicals already are in the water. And then it doesn't help if you refrigerate it then, or if you buy it refrigerated in the store. So no plastic bottles, no unfiltered tap water. Charcoal filter, a simple charcoal filter is enough to get out most of those chemicals. I mean, if you really want to go the extra mile and do it really well, get a reverse osmosis filtration system. We have actually 2 filtration systems in our home. One is a whole house filtration system that filters the water of the entire house. It takes out all the chlorine, all of the chemicals, everything that is important or they can potentially be endocrine disrupting or cause issues. It filters out. So we have clean water out of every tap in the house. But then we have, in addition, reverse osmosis filtration system under the sink that remineralizes the water, because I would not recommend drinking pure RO water because it's void of anything. And that's not a good thing, because typically water tries to maintain in a certain state with a certain set of minerals. And if the water is so stripped of everything, then it might leach those minerals from the food you eat or from your surrounding tissue. and that could potentially cause mineral deficiencies. So I recommend remineralized RO water. And so we have a reverse osmosis system and a whole house filtration system from a company we really like. I'm going to link it down below in the description in the show notes. So check that out. I have a review in the YouTube video on that as well. So you can check that out. But that's really one of the easiest way. But if you have nothing else, a filter in your freezer or your fridge, or just a screw-on filter or a Brita filter, is enough to filter your drinking water. I highly recommend that. Avoid plastic food storage containers, period. Replace them with glass, with stainless steel, with maybe silicon. So we have silicon bags that replace Ziploc bags. We have glass storage containers for the stuff that goes in the fridge, for leftovers, etc. We have glass storage containers for all of our, powders we have in the pantry. For whatever any food that comes in contact with the container, we try to use glass or stainless steel or silicon if it goes in the freezer, or maybe if we take it with us. Remove plastic. Plastic can leach endocrine disruptors into the food, especially if it's hot, warm, salty, acidic, etc. In the freezer, it's less of an issue. So if you use regular Ziploc bags in your freezer, that's okay. But as soon as you take it out and it's in the fridge, I recommend removing the Ziploc bag and putting it into glass or stainless steel. Personal care products. Most deodorants, lotions, soaps, sanitizers, makeup, they all have endocrine disruptors. Fortunately, there are not brands out there. I'm going to link down some in the show notes that we use that don't have any of those endocrine disruptors. I specifically look for anything for stuff that's free of fragrances, candles, etc. Huge source of phthalates, which are an endocrine disrupting chemical. Anything that has bens or fen in the word of the ingredient, we don't use. Um, I don't use sunscreen personally because most of those are either full of endocrine disruptors or they turn carcinogenic. Even the mineral-based ones we've learned are not so good for you. We're going to have a separate episode on sun exposure, sunburns, and what you can do to avoid and mitigate that. So we're going to talk too much about sunscreen, usually a big issue. Deodorant, sanitizers, lotions, creams, etc. Make sure you buy clean products that are free of phthalates, fragrances, and any of the other endocrine disruptors. Non-stick cookware, replace it with either stainless steel, cast iron. I mean, those are really the two top choices. That they are non-stick as well. At least the cast iron, if you season it properly, and we season it at home with tallow, then it doesn't stick and it doesn't have any of the endocrine disrupting issues. The only thing it might leach into the food is iron, but that's usually not a bad thing because a lot of people are iron deficient anyway. So that really helps there. In terms of clothing, use natural fibers as much as possible. Merino wool is one that I really like. Cotton, obviously, depending on the type of clothing, but if it's like underwear or socks, I typically stick with merino wool. Otherwise, organic cotton is a great choice. Any natural fiber basically is good. Anything synthetic, stretch, some of the performance wear, especially from brands like, I have to say it again, Lululemon and stuff, full of forever chemicals, especially if you sweat, as your pores open, they go right into your body and they stay there and won't go away anytime soon. So avoid those as much as you can. With plant foods, it's the same. Buy organic if you can, because then at least you avoid most of the synthetic chemicals. Now, organic does not mean free of pesticides and herbicides. There is a list of approved chemicals farmers can use that comply with the organic label, and those are not always good for your health either, but definitely better than non-organic. If you can't afford organic, then stick to the there. If you look for the dirty dozens or so, you find those that have the most chemicals. Typically, those I would avoid if you buy conventionally grown. Like grapes, for example, I would not buy non-organic because they have a lot of those chemicals on there. But there are other things where farmers typically use fewer chemicals, even if conventionally grown. So you can look that up but buy organic if you must, and be aware that there are many plants have natural defense chemicals like pesticides, and I have a video on that. I'm probably going to do an episode on that that this talks about some of those the most problematic ones, but basically, your leafy greens, your legumes, your root vegetables and tubers, etc., nightshades, those are all typically have more toxins than what you want to have in your body, whereas sweet fruits and squashes, like zucchini, for example, if you remove the seeds and the skin, then they have typically fewer chemicals, and you should do fairly well on them. In terms of furniture, that's really a big one because truly non-toxic furniture is super expensive. And one way to kind of bypass that issue is to either buy used furniture that has already off-gassed in someone else's home, or you really find, clean, non-toxic furniture. They're typically very expensive. We just looked at couches the other day, and there was I think that one of the cheaper ones we found was like 10 or 15 grand for, a couch. I'm like, come on, guys. But that's unfortunately what it is. So buying used is probably your best bet. And if you can't do that, then buy something that has maybe fewer issues, like a leather couch might have that was tanned with vegetable oils, might be less problematic. That's maybe the only reason or the only area where you want to consider even using or exposing yourself to vegetable oils. But those are usually less of an issue than fabric couches that have been treated with stainless or non-stain kind of coatings, etc., that off-gas significantly more. Um, if you can't, do non-toxic furniture, if you just, have to deal with what you have, one way to mitigate that, and that also goes then into improving your air quality at home, is to use bipolar ionization. It's basically a small device you can attach to your central AC unit if you have one, or even you can get plug-in ones, or like standalone ones. We use Hypo Air is the brand that we use. We have a whole house ionization system, bipolar ionization system that emits ions that get distributed by the HVAC system in the entire home, and those ions, they um, destroy pathogens, including VOCs. So they destroy bacteria, viruses on surfaces, in the air, as well as VOCs. So with that, you can mitigate it. You can also get standalone units if we have one in the bedroom to improve the air quality even more. And with smaller plug-in ones that they're called the Air Angel, for example, that we have in certain areas, like in our unfinished basement, where there's a higher likelihood of mold growing because of the humidity, etc. So that's one way to mitigate not only your air problems and furniture and paint and whatever you have in your house already that you cannot easily change, but also many other things that um, are more difficult to approach on a systemic level. Another thing that's very easy, very low-hanging fruit, just getting rid of the plastic cutting boards. Whenever you cut and you carve into the plastic, you get little tiny, sometimes microscopic pieces of plastic then attached to your food and get into your body. So by just using wooden cutting boards, ideally color code them. So use one type of wooden board for meat, the other one for produce maybe, so you don't mix and match, and potentially cross-contaminate. So that's a good idea. If you're into coffee or tea, buy products that have been tested for toxins, that are organic, and in the case of tea, that come in bags that are made from natural fibers and not plastic. Or just buy the pure tea basically without the bag, and then use a stainless steel mesh cup or whatever to make your tea. And then the last thing that is maybe potentially the most irritating, especially within the female audience here, is birth control. Birth control, by definition, hormonal birth control is endocrine disrupting. That's what it's meant to do. The problem with that is, I mean, if you've ever looked at that piece of paper that, if you extend, is probably 3 feet long or even longer, with all of the potential side effects, those are not theoretical side effects. Birth control significantly and negatively impacts your body. It causes a ton of potential issues. Some you might not see immediately, but over time. And the best advice I can give you is to not use birth control. And I know, we just had the very discussion with my brother-in-law, and his girlfriend. I'm like, so what are we gonna do? Well, I'm not a ultra conservative, kind of guy who says, well, you shouldn't have, intercourse unless it's, to make children. No, I don't have a hard stance on any of that. Do whatever you must, whatever you like, whatever makes you happy. But know that hormonal birth control is messes with your health in so many different ways, that the best thing you can do is to remove it and find other ways. You can use, control, measure your temperature. I mean, there are only so many days in a month. If you live a somewhat healthy lifestyle, you should have a regularly stable cycle, regular cycle. And so roughly, based on other tools that you can use, there's not with the Aura Ring, or even with Whoop, etc., with some of those trackers, you can tell when you're getting into your fertile days. You can measure your temperature. There are a whole of things that you can do to kind of figure out. And very often, just based on the feedback I've seen from women who do exactly that, it's just as accurate. And your risk of an unwanted pregnancy is just as low as doing some of the other things. But again, it's ultimately up to you. But just be aware, birth control, by definition, very much estrogenic, and can cause all of those issues that I've mentioned before. Now, I'd like to hear from you, though, what are some of those areas that you struggle most with? Because this is such a huge topic. And even though, I've given you like 13 or so tips on how you can address and mitigate those issues, every single one warrants really its own episode and its own discussion, because there is a lot of nuance, there is a lot of complexity, even with the plant-based world, what plants to avoid, etc., what personal care products to avoid, which ones are safe. I mean, we can dive into any of those in much more detail, but I'd like to hear from you, which are the ones that you think you are struggling most with, so we can address those first and then talk about some of the others in the future. And with that, we're gonna wrap it up. I hope you like this episode. Again, send me your questions via social media, via my blog, any of the channels that you find me on. Send me your feedback. Let me know what you want to hear next, what you want to dive into next, and we'll do that. And with that, we're going to wrap it up. Thanks for listening, and I'll hear you in the next episode.